Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 13. I am your show's host, Kyle. And before we get into the news today, I'd just like to remind everybody, if you could leave me a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, that would help the show to grow. Also, subscribe to the show on iTunes so you make sure not to miss an episode. If you could share the show with your friends and family, that would be very helpful. The more people we have informed on these issues, the easier it will be for people to cast smart votes when it comes time to vote. Vote for representatives and congressmen who aren't going to lead us into more wars. It will help for when there are important votes coming up for people to call their representatives and be informed and say, we don't want this next war, we don't want this next intervention. The more pressure we could put on Congress, the better it will be for the American people. These wars are bankrupting our country and making us less safe. They are, at this point, just providing propaganda for the terrorists, creating instability around the world that allows for places for the terrorist organizations to really breed and increase their reach. So the more we could do to prevent our government from intervening overseas, the safer the world will be for us, the more prosperous America will be, because we'll stop wasting so much money on these wars. It's incredible at how rich the weapons industry is getting and how poor the American people are getting because our congressmen keep giving our money to them for no reason other than to line their own pockets, because, man, the kickbacks come through. A lot of these congressmen get huge campaign contributions from Lockheed and Raytheon and Boeing, so all those things are important to keep in mind, and why this is so important that we do something about it. You know, not only is it immoral for us to go around the world and blowing people up and starving children and all these nasty things, but from a purely practical standpoint for American citizens, if you're just a self-concerned American, then you should not want your country to go around the world bombing people and blowing stuff up, because it makes you less safe, it makes you a target because your government's acting like this, and it also bankrupts the country and is, taking money out of your pockets to go drop a bomb on some poor guy in Yemen. It accomplishes nothing. It doesn't make you safer. This is obviously true. Since 9/11, the Al-Qaeda was, a couple hundred strong. Now there's tens of thousands of jihadists around the world, all thanks to USA. All right, so start with the news stories now. I got a couple domestic issues, stuff going on here at home before we get to the stuff overseas. First one, Trump is looking to loosen the counterterrorism rules. So under President Obama, he put in place some rules that I think mostly just made the terror war look a little better. I don't know how many practical effects it had to actually reduce civilian casualties or anything like that, but there was a lot of negative attention coming to Obama's drone war and stuff like that. There were stats coming out saying that only 2% of the people killed in drone attacks were actually targets. They were labeling all military-aged men as terrorists with or without proof. So if you're 16 or older and you're a guy, you're a target for a U.S. drone, and no justice will ever be done for you. And so Obama looked into and put some kind of restrictions on what was going on with the drone program and with the raids we carried out. I don't think it stopped many raids from happening, but they at least required more executive supervision, and Trump is looking to loosen those rules and cut back on that. I would imagine this is only a bad thing. I don't know how much the rules helped, but repealing them will, only make the situation worse, allow for more attacks, more drone strikes, and with, less regulation from the administration. I guess it'll also make the administration at least feel less accountable for it, because then if something really goes wrong, they say, oh, well, we didn't even know about that one. And so maybe it's a way for the Trump administration to kind of approve these airstrikes and raids with a wink and a nod rather than an official seal of approval. The other method they may use to really expand the terror war and have less restrictions on what they're doing is declaring certain regions areas of hostilities. This is what Obama did with the region of Sirte in Libya. I think starting in 2016 of the Obama presidency, he started a war in Libya against ISIS. That war, we ended up dropping about 500 bombs on the city of Sirte to try to get ISIS out of that city. Of course, ISIS would have never been in the city in the first place had Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama not decided to bomb Gaddafi out of power. However, this is just one of those unintended consequences from our stampeding around the world and killing people everywhere, anytime, for when those people pose no real threat to the American people at all. Gaddafi wasn't a threat to Americans. However, Gaddafi was no threat to the American people. He may have pose some threat to his own people, but those people are certainly worse off now under ISIS rule and having competing governments blowing each other up everywhere. It's certainly the stability of the country was a lot better, as I've outlined before. You have like 2/3 of refugees coming through Libya reporting they have either been raped or sexually abused, and a lot of those times it was by people in military uniforms. So nasty stuff going on in Libya thanks to that. So back to the original point was Obama decides to label CERT a area of hostilities, and this allowed him to conduct airstrikes on the city without congressional approval. Ends up dropping 495 bombs on the city. It takes months and months to actually clear the city out. He actually needed to renew this a couple times. Originally he had like 30 days or 90 days and then had to renew it 2 or 3 times to fully get rid of ISIS in the city. Of course, ISIS just moves around. It's not a situation where we defeated ISIS in Libya, and Islamists still hold significant territory in the city and are actually fighting against General Haftar for some oil fields in that country right now. So it's a mess in Libya, but this is the kind of the loosening that Trump could do. So he could declare a certain area of Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia as areas of hostilities and then go to work bombing those countries. Of course, the Trump administration won't be responsible if he kills civilians in those countries. It won't require a declaration of war or any stamp of approval from Congress. I suppose if Congress really wanted to stand up and do something about it, they could certainly, wag their finger and say no and pass a resolution, and that may put some constraints on what the Trump administration could do, but I don't see that happening. You do have some senators with some backbone here, like Senator Rand Paul, who've tried to kind of rein in presidential war powers, but it just doesn't have popular support. And unless U.S. citizens start blowing up the congressional switchboard and demanding that we rein in the power of the presidents to declare unilateral war and just go to war whenever he wants, then I don't think we're going to see any changes on this issue. Another issue where we're seeing some, I think, step back from some of the more positive changes that the Obama administration made is that Jeff Sessions says that Gitmo would be a good place to send any detainees we have. So while Obama failed on his original 2008 campaign promise to close Guantanamo Bay, and I mean this was really shameful on his part. This is something that if he wanted to close, he could do it. If he decides that he could start a war in Libya anytime he wants without congressional approval, or start a war in Syria, without congressional approval, he certainly could close that military base. However, he didn't want to. It wasn't worth spending his political capital on that issue. He rather armed terrorists in Syria and pass healthcare laws than close a torture facility. So, not the humanitarian he claims to be. However, Sessions really wants to start going the other way on that and sending more people to Guantanamo Bay. This will serve as really good propaganda for the terrorists. People in the Middle East know what has been done at Guantanamo Bay. They understand that this was a torture facility, that innocent people were tortured there. People who were rounded up either because people were looking to collect bounties because the United States was paying people to turn in suspected terrorists, and so I think some people probably decided to turn in their neighbors because maybe they didn't like their neighbors, and also they could make a couple $1,000 by turning them in. And in Afghanistan or Yemen, when there's not a lot of money to be had, a couple $1,000 is pretty good, so turn that person in. Or a lot of times there's cases of mistaken identity. There's actually a village or a town in Yemen that's named Al-Qaeda, and so I think there was a few people that ended up in Guantanamo Bay because either translators or somebody from the U.S. mistook them saying, I'm from Al-Qaeda to be I'm in Al-Qaeda, and they end up in Guantanamo Bay. They get tortured for no reason, and so what the terrorists will do is they'll say, hey, look, you could be just the regular man on the street here, but if you run the risk of the United States throwing you in this prison and torturing you, whether you're a member of Al-Qaeda or not, so why not join up and try to fight them? And this is what we see. And so this is why it's really stupid for Jeff Sessions to want to throw more people in Guantanamo Bay, because the bigger the prison gets, the more the Al-Qaeda and the other terrorists will be able to use this propaganda. Even if we're not torturing people there now, the narrative on Guantanamo Bay is already set. This is a torture camp, so that's pretty shameful and stupid to do. You would think that they would at least have enough sense to close Guantanamo Bay and open up another prison somewhere else. Even if they do the same things at Guantanamo Bay they're doing other places, at least it won't have the negative optics. But as usual, the U.S. government isn't particularly smart. It's unfortunate that we're going to move the other way on Guantanamo Bay. Another international news story that came out of Washington is that the U.S. asked Cambodia to repay its war debt. The Cambodian government owes the United States over $600 million in war debt. This debt occurred around the time of the Vietnam War. Originally, the debt was $200 million or so, but because the government has never been able to make those payments, interest has increased the amount of principal owed. I think almost tripled it, actually. It's really a kind of a shameful thing for the U.S. government to ask Cambodia for this money. The money probably should be forgiven. The U.S. government dropped tons and tons of bombs on Cambodia during the Vietnam War. I believe it was try to cut off weapons funneling through Cambodia to North Vietnam. In that bombing campaign, the U.S. probably killed 500,000 people. Those are the estimates. And so you would think that the U.S. government would have the decency just to forget the war debt and let it go, since it set up such a negative situation in Cambodia. It really drove the people of Cambodia to adopt a socialist and push for a socialist regime, which ended up killing another 2 million Cambodians. And it's really a negative situation, and it would probably look good for the U.S. on an international stage just to forgive the debt, to go ask for, $600 million, which is just a drop in the bucket compared to what the U.S. spends on all the stupid and frivolous things around the world. It makes no sense to ask for this money. So, all right, move on to the next story. The U.S. has no set plan for what's to happen in Raqqa. It seems like the general trend or what's happening is that the U.S. is moving towards using the Kurds to take over Raqqa. However, Raqqa is an Arab city, and the Kurds are more or less a different ethnicity than the Arab population. And so it doesn't seem likely that the U.S. and the Kurds would be able to occupy Raqqa and have much popular support from that population. And so the U.S. is looking to take over Raqqa with Kurdish help and then give that territory to the Assad government. This seems like one of the more stupid things that I could imagine the U.S. government doing. If it's just going to give the territory to Assad anyways, why not just let Assad and the Russians take over and not waste American money and lives taking over the city? That seems more sensible to me. One decent thing about this plan is it seems to acknowledge that the Syrian rebels are either defeated or just terrorists anyways, and we're not going to support them. So having that acknowledgement is good, and maybe it'll prevent some bad policies from taking place in the future. One of the main issues I have with this is that we're moving troops into Syria. We're moving Marines into Syria, and we don't even know what we're going to do with them yet. It seems like quite the odd thing to do. It seems that if the U.S. were to be moving troops into a country, they should have a plan for what's going to happen. This is kind of the same situation with Libya, where we started bombing the country and didn't really have a plan of what, victory looked like or what would happen when we were done bombing that country. I mean, we should have a plan in place before we start blowing things up and doing things. At least know what we're trying to accomplish here, and it doesn't seem like we have any idea what we're trying to accomplish here. On top of the troops we're already moving to Raqqa, the U.S. is moving another 2,500 troops to Kuwait. These troops are preparing to be deployed either to Mosul or Raqqa. It looks like the U.S. is setting up a situation where we're probably going to occupy one of the two cities, if not both, with our troops. This will probably put our troops in a lot of harm's way and could really lead to a lot of death of U.S. troops. So let's hope the Trump administration doesn't follow through with this. And I think one of the final things the Trump administration is waiting for before they set the plan in place for Raqqa is what happens in Turkey with they're having a referendum there. That referendum will essentially make Erdogan a dictator of the country and give him a lot more power than has been held in the presidency in the past. Maybe they're hoping that after the referendum, Erdogan's rhetoric towards the Kurds kind of diminishes, and maybe he's just bolstering here and sounding the alarms to gain some support from his people war is typically good for the leaders of countries. I don't know why people rally around the leaders whenever they have war, but this seems to be, maybe a move. So middle of April, I believe that vote's happening. So after that, we're going to hear what's going on. But that's a long time for our troops to be in Syria with no real plan in place or idea of what they're going to be doing. Other news out of Syria. We have al-Nusra carrying out a suicide bombing in Damascus. That bombing killed, I believe, 74 people. A lot of people died in that bombing. There is quite a big range of the numbers when you look at how many people actually died in that bombing there. 74 high, 40 low. I think most of the people that were killed were Iraqi pilgrims coming to Damascus. Like I said, the attack, al-Nusra has claimed responsibility for the attack. Terrorist organization that certainly has gotten their hands on some U.S. weapons, either directly from the U.S. government or more likely in the case of al-Nusra, since al-Nusra is linked to al-Qaeda, they got those weapons from other groups that the U.S. armed. The final story I'd like to talk about of Syria is that the situation for children is getting worse there. In 2016, there was a 20% increase in children deaths in Syria, and there was a threefold increase in the number of children recruited into the ranks of militias and militaries. So we're really seeing a situation in Syria where children are dying more frequently. This is probably because so many children have lost parents and food's running out, supplies are running low. You have a lot of situations where towns were besieged and continue to be, and so it's just becoming a worse and worse place for children. And then with the increase in child soldiers, this could be that as more and more people die, the militias are getting more desperate for troops and are willing to put guns in the hands of just about anyone. It could also be a situation where children really can't fend for themselves and are enlisting in these militias just because that's the only way they're going to be able to eat. Either way, it's a terrible situation for these poor kids, and the U.S. is in a lot of ways responsible for this. We prolonged this intervention. We propped up the rebels by giving them so many arms, creating so much problems for Assad. He couldn't focus on ISIS. The U.S. really could have just cut down on all this death and destruction by not intervening in the country and allowing the civil war to play out for itself. But now we have a situation in Syria where kids are dying by the hundreds, being recruited into the ranks of militias, and 70% are diagnosed with toxic stress. So it's a miserable situation, and man, we should just leave it alone. All right, moving across the border into Iraq. According to the Iraqi government, western Mosul is now 30% under control of the government. This number seems to be right in the amount of landmass. I saw a couple maps giving indications of what the government controls and what ISIS controls. However, I guess the Iraqi military is probably always going to give the biggest number possible, and they want to make it sound like they're winning. I remember when the battle for East Mosul was going on, the number was always really high. It was like, oh, we got 80%, and then it turns out ISIS still controls half of the city or something. So anytime you see these numbers, just be skeptical, and they don't always indicate what they seem to indicate. The Iraqi government does admit that 11 civilians were killed by a U.S. coalition airstrike. U.S. didn't have any statements on this, but again, increases anti-Americanism. It certainly isn't going to make the coalition or the Iraqi military any more popular for bombing their civilians too. I'm sure there's some understanding on behalf of the civilians that they're trying to get rid of ISIS in the city. However, if the bombs are going off so indiscriminately that we're killing civilians as well, are we really accomplishing anything? Probably not much. The last news out of Mosul is that 100,000 civilians have been displaced from western Mosul so far. The refugee camps are filling up. The UN is trying to open another refugee camp to take in all these additional people. However, I think it's going to get pretty desperate. It seems like they're using a lot more airstrikes in western Mosul, so there's going to be a lot less places in the city to live when the airstrikes are done falling. They blow up houses and buildings and everything, and apartment buildings, so people won't have a place to live in this city. They'll need to flee to refugee camps, but there's not that many refugee camps available right now, so we could see a situation soon where there's a lot of people dying out in the desert there. Moving to Afghanistan, we have eight Afghani policemen killed by a Taliban infiltrator. We're seeing these kinds of attacks more and more coming out of Afghanistan, where a member of the Taliban will pose as a recruit for the Afghani police. The Afghani police are getting more and more desperate to recruit people into their ranks because they've had so many people die, and pretty likely job that you'll get yourself killed, and I don't think it pays particularly well, so it's harder to get people in those ranks. And with, being more desperate, they end up with more and more people in their ranks that aren't friendly to them, and so Taliban members are infiltrating them, and then they go and they shoot the Afghan police members. This time 8 died. In the past, it's been more. Definitely something to keep our eyes on, and it seems like a developing story out of Afghanistan. In Yemen, just like to remind everybody that as of March 2017, this is the 2-year anniversary of the Saudi war in Yemen. Been going on for 2 years now, and it's just as bloody and indiscriminate bombing as when it started. We have 22 killed in a market in northern Yemen. Again, this market was near a port town. The people inside the market in no way were fighters, and this was a civilian target hit. Why it was hit, was it a mistake? Was it Saudi Arabia doing it on purpose to try to maybe force the civilians to turn on the Houthis, or maybe they're just trying to inflict as much death and destruction to the people of Yemen as they can? Who really knows what the motivations of the Saudi government are? However, the U.S. is and continues to support the Saudi bombing campaign that's killing all these civilians. It seems like Trump is increasing support for the Saudi government, not rolling it back. And so, once again, this is definitely going to create anti-Americanism and make matters worse for the United States here. Once again, I think I've talked about this before, but I really just want to make it clear that the U.S. is really helping Al-Qaeda with their fighting in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is fighting against the Houthis, who are the main enemies of Al-Qaeda. Also, you have situations in Yemen, and this kind of came to light after the botched U.S. raid, I think, where villages who don't want to be a part of the Houthi government really don't have any defense from the Houthis except for Al-Qaeda. And so you may have Al-Qaeda fighting against the Houthis in these areas, and the people feeling more sympathy for Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda is the only group really fighting against the Houthis. I don't think Hadi has all that much of a government. A lot of it seems to be troops that Saudi Arabia is paying, so who knows how loyal they are, or they just are collecting paychecks and don't really want to fight. But that's something to be concerned about, and it's really just aiding Al-Qaeda to fight against the Houthis. It's allowing the spread of Al-Qaeda. Like I said, there's not much of a government or an army for the Yemeni government controlled by Hadi. Yeah, just a really bad situation in Yemen. In fact, while the UN numbers only put 10,000 people dead from the conflict, journalists on the ground, one in particular, Nasser Arabi, puts the death count at 50,000. The reason the UN number is so low is that it only counts deaths that come from hospitals. Unfortunately, in Yemen, there's not many hospitals operating. This is mostly because Saudi Arabia decided to bomb a ton of them. Yeah, and so a lot of people are either dying on their way to the hospital, they get blown up by bombs, and they don't end up going to the hospital, or the hospital's been blown up itself, so there's nowhere to go, there's nobody to count those dead that just die. Once again, bad situation, and like always, this is making the situation worse for America. We're giving the Saudis bombs, we're refueling their planes. The people of Yemen know this war couldn't be happening without the support of the United States. And so it's not only are they mad at Saudi Arabia for bombing them, they're also mad at the United States for letting it happen. Final story of the day is that tensions continue to increase in the South China Sea. Japan is going to sail its biggest warship through the South China Sea. This is sure to upset the Chinese. The warship's going to spend 3 months in the South China Sea visiting ports along the way, and then it's going to end up in the Indian Ocean to conduct some war games with the U.S. and Indian warships. So another situation where tensions are only going to escalate, and the U.S. could really cut back on this by pulling back some support from Japan or leaning on its allies in Japan not to do this. And the U.S. is putting a lot of military equipment within the South China Sea region as well. And so we're just seeing a lot of saber-rattling there. Definitely something to be concerned about, especially since Trump isn't super tactful. We're not dealing with jihadists here. You can't just drop bombs on China like you can in the Middle East without seeing a lot of retaliation. Alright, I think that does it for today. Again, if you could give me a rating and review on iTunes, that would be helpful. Subscribe to the show there. If you like what I'm doing here, check out my website, kylesfilesblog.com. The website for the podcast is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. Think about joining the private Facebook group that I have for the podcast, Foreign Policy Focus. Alright, everybody, and hope you enjoyed your weekend, and I'll see you on Wednesday.